It was a calm, uneventful evening at Earth's Space Command Center when the quiet was shattered by a sharp, insistent beeping. A distress signal had come through, faint but urgent, originating from deep within uncharted space. The crew at the monitoring station scrambled to decode the message, the words crackling and distorted. The voice that came through was alien, but the panic in it was unmistakable. The message was clear. A crew aboard a ship called the Galactic was in danger, surrounded by hostile forces, and their survival was uncertain. The leader of the Galactic, Adira Vel, a tall, determined woman with long dark hair and eyes, as sharp as a hawk's, had managed to send one final signal before the ship's systems began to fail. Her voice was strained as she spoke, her words punctuated by bursts of static. "We need help. The enemy is closing in. Please, someone, hear us." Back on Earth, the gravity of the situation was immediately understood. Earth's military was vast, but their resources were spread thin across the galaxy. Still, one person was considered Earth's finest hope: Drake, a fearless pilot known throughout the galaxy for his unmatched skills and cool-headed approach in the most dangerous situations. His reputation had earned him respect from the highest ranks, and when his name was brought up in connection to the distress signal, all eyes turned to him. Keros was not the type to back away from a challenge. With his messy brown hair, sharp jawline, and piercing green eyes that always seemed to be calculating his next move, Keros had earned his place in the stars. He wasn't just a pilot. He was a legend. Keros listened intently to the transmission, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the console as he absorbed every word, every crackle of static. His mission was simple: rescue the alien crew and bring them back safely. But there was no guarantee the Galactic would still be in one piece by the time he arrived. The threat posed by the alien species who had attacked them was unknown, but the desperation in Adira's voice was enough to set Keros' pulse racing. He had faced countless enemies in space, but the unknown was always the most dangerous opponent. Without hesitation, Keros stood from his seat. He strode confidently to the cockpit of his ship, the Vanguard, his trusted vessel, ready for anything. His crew, though small, were just as skilled and prepared as he was. Together, they would embark on this mission into the unknown. They didn't know much about the enemy, but Keros' instincts were sharp, and he trusted them with his life. The ship's engines roared to life as the Vanguard lifted off, headed toward the Galactic at full speed. Keros wasn't the kind of man to be intimidated by an unknown enemy, and with his unwavering confidence, he was the perfect person to answer the call. The stars stretched before him like a vast ocean, and as his ship cut through the darkness, he could feel the weight of what was to come. This would be no ordinary mission, but Keros was ready. Drake stood at the helm of the Vanguard, his fingers lightly grazing the controls as the ship hummed beneath him. The blackness of space stretched out endlessly before him, but it was no longer an empty void. It was now a battleground. The distress signal from the Galactic had reached him with such urgency that it sent a chill through his spine, but he was a man of action, not fear. This was what he was trained for, what he excelled at. The mission was simple enough on paper: find the alien ship, neutralize the threat, and get the crew to safety. But Keros knew that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed in space. The Galactic's crew, led by the composed and fierce Adira Vel, were in more danger than anyone on Earth could have anticipated. As the Vanguard hurtled through space, Keros reflected on the little information they had. The alien crew, though experienced, was outnumbered. The enemy was not just a typical hostile force. They were a group of relentless, ruthless marauders known to wipe out anyone who dared stand against them. The species had been whispered about in the darker corners of the galaxy, but no one had encountered them firsthand. That was about to change. On Earth, the call to action had gone out. Keros wasn't the only one preparing for the mission. Back at the space station, the military was coordinating the details, gathering all the resources available. However, no one doubted that the mission's success rested in the hands of Keros and his unparalleled skill. His reputation had traveled across the stars. He was the best pilot Earth had ever produced. His fearless leadership had led him through countless dangerous missions, and he always emerged victorious. But even he knew that this one could be different. In the quiet of the cockpit, the rhythmic hum of the engines was the only sound that filled the space around Keros. He focused his attention on the control panel, mentally running through the steps of the mission. He would need to locate the Galantor, navigate the battlefield, and dock with the alien ship, all while evading the enemy's pursuit. The task seemed impossible, but for someone like Keros, the impossible was just a challenge waiting to be conquered. He wasn't a man who flinched in the face of danger. His green eyes narrowed as he prepared himself for what was coming. Meanwhile, on the Galantor, Adira Vel and her crew were fighting a battle of their own. Adira's dark eyes never left the damaged hull of their ship as her hands flew over the controls, trying to keep the ship's life support systems running. Her people were trained for every scenario, except this one. Their ship had been severely damaged, and the enemy was closing in with a cruel, unrelenting force. Yet Adira remained calm, her leadership unwavering. Her crew looked to her for guidance, and she would not let them down. Back on the Vanguard, Keros received a final communication from Earth's command center. The message was clear. The enemy's reinforcements were on the way, and time was running out. There was no more room for hesitation. He set his jaw, prepared for whatever lay ahead. It was time to face the unknown, and he was ready to do whatever it took to save the crew of the Galantor, even if it meant flying straight into the heart of danger. Keros Drake's heart pounded as the Vanguard sliced through the vast emptiness of space, pushing the limits of speed with every passing moment. He was nearing the coordinates of the Galantor, the alien ship now just a blip on his radar. The journey had been tense, but as the minutes passed, the thrill of the mission washed over him. This wasn't just a rescue. This was his chance to prove that no challenge, no matter how dangerous, could ever make him back down. The unknown enemy was closing in on the Galantor, but Keros was undeterred. With his hands steady on the controls, he felt ready to face whatever awaited him. On the Galantor, Adira Vel was equally focused. Her eyes scanned the flashing screens, her mind sharp as she worked tirelessly to keep her crew together. Her reputation as a leader had been earned through years of battle and countless hardships, but even she couldn't have predicted a situation like this. The ship had sustained critical damage, and the enemy fleet was closing in fast. She didn't have time to waste. Her orders were clear: keep the crew alive, hold the line, and wait for help. The signal had gone out, and now all they could do was hope that Earth's best pilot would answer the call. Adira's mind raced through strategies as she paced the control room. She had faced many enemies before, but none like this. The marauders they were up against had no mercy, no sense of honor. They came to conquer, to destroy. Yet, Adira refused to surrender. She was a leader, and her crew depended on her. Her sharp instincts had kept them alive this long, and she would not let them down now. Keros could feel the tension building as he finally neared the Galantor. He switched to the communication channel, and Adira's voice crackled through the static. Her calm but urgent tone immediately reassured him. "This is Adira Vel of the Galantor. We're still here, but the enemy is closing in. Can you make it to us in time?" Keros' grip tightened on the controls as he responded, his voice steady despite the pressure. "I'm on my way. Adira, just hold on. Help is coming." His words were simple, but the promise behind them was clear. He was Earth's best pilot, and he would not fail. Adira nodded, her dark eyes narrowing as she turned her focus back to the screens in front of her. She knew that Keros' reputation wasn't just for show. His skills were unmatched, and if anyone could get them out of this alive, it was him. But there was no time to waste. The enemy was almost upon them. As much as she trusted Keros, she couldn't afford to rely on anyone but herself and her crew. She needed to stay strong. In the cockpit of the Vanguard, Caro's mind raced as he calculated his approach. The Galanter was badly damaged, and the enemy ship wasn't far behind. He had only one chance to get this right. The stakes were high, and there was no room for error. As he pushed the Vanguard to its limits, he couldn't help but admire Adira's resolve. She had led her crew through the worst, and now they were relying on him. It was time to make good on his promise. He would get them to safety, no matter what it took. Caros Drake's pulse quickened as he locked onto the Galanter's coordinates. His ship, the Vanguard, was closing in fast, but the situation was far from ideal. The enemy ship, a towering behemoth of dark metal, loomed in the distance like a shadow of death. The Galanter, still drifting and heavily damaged, was surrounded, its systems barely holding together under the assault. Caro's grip tightened on the controls, and he pushed the Vanguard even faster, feeling the rush of adrenaline surge through him. He could see the enemy ship now, its weapons primed and ready, a hulking force intent on destruction. But Caros wasn't fazed. He had been in tight spots before, but this one felt different. There was no room for mistakes. Through the comm system, Adira's voice came through again, calm but edged with urgency. Caros, we're running out of time. The enemy is preparing for another attack. We need you to dock now. Caros didn't need to be told twice. He could feel the weight of her words, the pressure of the situation. He had no intention of failing her or the crew of the Galanter. The clock was ticking, and every second mattered. He checked his instruments once more, calculating his approach to the wrecked ship. The Galanter was drifting erratically, its engines barely functioning. It was a miracle it hadn't been destroyed already. But this was no time for awe, only action. He pushed the Vanguard into a steep dive, narrowly avoiding the incoming enemy fire. The Vanguard danced through space with the grace of a predator, every movement fluid and precise. Caros' fingers moved deftly over the controls, steering the ship closer and closer to the Galanter. It was going to be a tight fit. He could feel the strain on the ship's systems as he approached at breakneck speed. He had one shot at this. The enemy ship fired again, but Caros was ready. With a sharp turn, he dodged the blasts, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the ship's warning alarms blaring, but he drowned them out, his focus fixed solely on the task at hand. The Vanguard was shaking violently as it endured the sudden turns and close calls. He wasn't sure how much longer the ship's systems could hold up, but he had no choice but to keep pushing forward. "Hold on, Adira," he muttered under his breath, his voice tight with determination. Through the comm, Adira's voice was steady, but there was a hint of disbelief in her words. "You're insane, Caros, but I've never seen anyone fly like you. Get us in there. Now." With a deep breath, Caros steeled himself. The Vanguard was now just meters away from the Galanter. He expertly maneuvered his ship into position, the docking clamps extending as he prepared for the impossible. The enemy was closing in on them, but Caros didn't falter. With a final, precise movement, the Vanguard made contact with the Galanter, the sound of metal meeting metal ringing through the cockpit. The docking was rough, but it was done. Caros quickly unstrapped himself from his seat, grabbing his gear as he prepared to board the alien ship. The battle wasn't over yet, but the first step in the rescue was complete. He could hear the Galanter's emergency systems still blaring, but now they had a fighting chance. It was up to him and Adira to finish what they had started, together. As Caros stepped off the Vanguard and onto the Galanter, the situation was even worse than he had imagined. The alien ship's interior was dark, flickering with malfunctioning lights, and the air felt heavy with tension. Adira Vel, the leader of the crew, was waiting for him near the control center. Her face, normally calm and composed, now showed signs of exhaustion, but her determination shone through. She looked at him with a mixture of relief and urgency. "Glad you made it," she said, her voice low but steady. "But we don't have much time. The enemy is preparing to board. We have to act fast." Caros nodded, his eyes scanning the room. The damage to the Galanter was severe, But it wasn't the ship that concerned him. It was the crew. They were hurt, weary, and fighting to stay alive. But despite the chaos, there was something in the air that caught his attention. It was the artifact. In the far corner of the room, a glowing object sat on a pedestal, surrounded by protective beams of light. It pulsed with an otherworldly energy, drawing Caro's gaze like a magnet. He could sense its power, but he had no idea what it was. Adira followed his eyes, understanding instantly what he was looking at. "The artifact," she said, her voice soft, but with a hint of reverence. "It's our last hope. But activating it, it's not something we can do alone. We need a guide, someone who knows the old ways." Caros frowned. "You need someone who knows how to use it." Adira nodded gravely. "Yes, it's a weapon, a relic from my people's ancient past. But it's complicated. It requires knowledge of our technology, something that hasn't been passed down for generations. I've been trained, but I don't know enough to use it properly." Before Caros could respond, a sudden tremor shook the ship, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps outside the door. The enemy was closing in, and there was no more time to discuss the artifact. "We don't have the luxury of waiting," Adira said. "We need that artifact, or we're not getting out of here. If you can help me figure it out, we might have a chance." Caros didn't hesitate. He had come here to save the crew, and if the artifact was their only shot, he would find a way to make it work. He studied the artifact from a distance, noticing intricate symbols etched into its surface. It was clear that this wasn't just a weapon. It was a key to something much bigger. "Tell me what you know," he said to Adira, his tone firm. As they worked together, Adira explained the history of the artifact. It was a relic from an ancient time, a powerful tool used by her people to defend against enemies far more dangerous than the ones now chasing them. She didn't understand all its secrets, but the few clues her ancestors had left behind suggested that its power could only be unlocked through a combination of the right knowledge and the right person. Caros listened carefully, piecing together what little he could. The more they worked, the clearer it became. The artifact was their only hope. But the cost of unlocking its power was high, and neither of them knew if they would survive the process. Just as they made their final adjustments, a loud crash echoed through the ship. The enemy had arrived. The battle for the Galanter was about to begin in earnest. The enemy's footsteps were growing louder, and the air aboard the Galanter seemed to thicken with the weight of impending danger. Caros and Adira stood close to the artifact, their hands working quickly to activate it. But the constant sound of the marauder ships pounding against the hull made their task harder. Caros felt the pressure mounting with every passing second. There was no room for mistakes. If they failed to activate the artifact in time, they would all be dead. But as the sounds of enemy forces grew nearer, something unexpected happened. Adira glanced at Caros, and for the first time, she saw him not just as a pilot who had come to their rescue, but as someone who was fighting right alongside her. She had led many missions in her lifetime, but this was different. Here, standing next to her, was a human, someone from a distant planet, someone who had no reason to care about the fate of her people. And yet, Caros had risked everything to come here, to help her and her crew. Their hands brushed briefly as they worked together, both moving in sync to decipher the alien symbols on the artifact. Adira's eyes met Caros for a split second, and she realized something. She had always believed that her strength lay in her leadership, in her ability to keep her crew alive, no matter the cost. But in this moment, she saw something in Caros that mirrored her own determination. He wasn't just here to follow orders or to prove himself. He was here because he believed in something bigger than just surviving. He believed in helping others, even in the face of impossible odds. Caros, too, felt a shift in the air. At first, he had seen this mission as another job, another chance to prove his skill as the best pilot in the galaxy. But now, with Adira at his side, he realized there was more to it. He wasn't just fighting for survival or for his reputation. He was fighting for a cause, for people who had trusted him with their lives. He had always been a loner, a man who depended only on himself. But now, as he and Adira shared a quiet moment of understanding, he knew that this mission wasn't just about him. It was about both of them. Together, they unlocked the final sequence on the artifact. The power surged through the room, and the artifact began to glow brighter, its energy building like a storm. The room filled with an electric hum as the artifact's power activated, and for a moment, all was still. But then, the enemy forces began to breach the doors, and the silence was shattered by the sounds of combat. The artifact, now fully activated, was their only chance to survive. Kairos and Adira stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next. The bond between them had solidified in that moment of shared purpose, two leaders from different worlds, fighting together for the same goal. With the artifact's power at their disposal, they turned to face the oncoming enemy, their hearts steady and their resolve unbreakable. This wasn't just a battle for survival anymore. It was a battle for something greater, something worth fighting for. And no matter what happened next, they would face it together. The enemy's forces were relentless, their footsteps echoing through the Galanter's metal hallways as they stormed the ship. The lights flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows as Kairos and Adira stood shoulder to shoulder, preparing for the final battle. The artifact's power pulsed in the room, its energy humming through the ship's structure, but the real fight was only just beginning. Kairos wiped the sweat from his brow, his green eyes narrowing in determination. The artifact had given them a fighting chance, but it wouldn't be enough if they couldn't hold off the Marauders long enough to make use of it. He gripped the control panel tightly, listening intently to the sounds of enemy soldiers moving closer. They had to act fast. There was no time for hesitation. The fate of the Galanter and its crew rested in their hands. Adira stood beside him, her dark eyes sharp and focused. She had led many battles in her time, but nothing like this. Her alien race had faced threats before, but this was different. The Galanter was barely holding together, and the odds were stacked against them. But there was no room for doubt now. Her people were counting on her, and Kairos was their only hope of escape. "Are you ready?" Adira asked, her voice calm, but with a steely edge. Kairos glanced over at her, meeting her gaze with a nod. "Always," he said, his voice steady. They moved swiftly through the ship, navigating through the corridors that seemed to shrink with every passing second. The enemy was closing in, but they weren't about to back down. Kairos led the way, his pulse quickening as he heard the sound of boots pounding against the floor. The Marauders were right behind them. Adira, with her own training and skill, took the lead in the next phase of the plan. She directed the crew to secure the ship's remaining weapon systems, hoping to hold the enemy at bay long enough to give Kairos a chance to get the artifact's power working. She knew that this wasn't just about survival, it was about something much bigger. The artifact could turn the tide, but only if they could get it online in time. With every step they took, the tension mounted. Kairos moved with precision, his instincts honed through years of flying in the most dangerous of situations. His heart raced, but he kept his mind focused. There was no room for fear. The Galanter had come too far, and the crew had already sacrificed too much. They couldn't lose now. Just as they reached the control room, a heavy blast shook the ship. The door to the control center blew open, and a dozen Marauders poured in, their weapons drawn and ready to strike. But Kairos wasn't backing down. He lunged into action, using his quick reflexes to dodge the incoming fire. His blaster was already in hand, and he fired with deadly accuracy, taking down the first few attackers. Adira didn't hesitate. She joined him, her own weapon aimed and steady. The two of them fought side by side, each movement seamless as they covered one another's backs. With every enemy they took down, the Galanter's systems came closer to full activation. The artifact pulsed with energy, its light brighter and stronger than ever before. As the last of the Marauders fell, the ship's alarms went silent, and a calm silence settled over the Galanter. Adira and Kairos stood side by side, breathing heavily but unbroken. The battle had been fierce, but they had won. The Galactic was still standing, and with the artifact now fully powered, they had a fighting chance to escape. Together, they had pushed through the final test, and as they exchanged a look of shared victory, they knew this was just the beginning of a new alliance, one that could change the fate of both their worlds forever. The silence that followed the battle was almost unbearable. The Galactic had finally come to a standstill, its systems humming back to life as the energy from the artifact coursed through the ship. Adira Vel stood at the control panel, her hands trembling slightly as she checked the status of the ship. The enemy had been repelled, at least for now, but the cost of the battle was written in the damage around them. The ship was far from safe, yet they had survived, and that was more than anyone could have hoped for just hours earlier. Karos Drake stood beside her, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. The fight had been grueling, and while he was proud of his skills, he couldn't shake the weight of the lives they had just saved. His eyes scanned the room, his mind already racing ahead to the next challenge. The enemy would be back. They always came back. But for now, they had won. Adira turned to him, her gaze meeting his with a look that spoke volumes. There was no need for words. They had shared the intensity of the fight, relied on each other in ways that neither of them had expected. What had begun as a mission of survival had turned into something more, a bond forged in the fires of battle. She owed him more than she could express, but she couldn't dwell on that now. There was still too much to do. "Are you sure the systems are stable?" Karos asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. The ship had been on the brink of destruction, and even though the artifact had given them a glimmer of hope, it didn't guarantee safety. There was still the possibility of a total breakdown. Adira nodded, but her face remained tense. "The systems are stabilized for now, but it won't last long. We'll need to find a way to repair the core before the damage spreads. If we can't, we'll be stranded." Karos took a deep breath, knowing the next phase of their journey wasn't going to be easy. The artifact had worked wonders, but it had also drained much of the ship's remaining power. Time was running out. "We'll make it," he said firmly. Together. As they moved through the corridors of the Galactic, checking the damage and ensuring the crew was safe, Adira couldn't help but notice how Karos had changed. The man who had arrived with only the promise of rescue had become a trusted ally. His confidence, his drive to keep going no matter the odds, it was contagious. Adira had fought beside many, but never had she found someone who matched her resolve so perfectly. She felt a spark of hope for the first time in days. Maybe they could truly survive this together. But even as she felt the weight of that hope, she also understood the reality of their situation. There was no easy solution. Sacrifices had already been made, and more would follow. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Karos stood beside her, his hand brushing against hers in a moment of quiet solidarity. The sound of the ship's engines humming to life was a reminder of their victory, but it was also a reminder of the danger they still faced. They were both well aware that the road ahead was uncertain. Yet, as they looked at each other, a silent promise passed between them. They would face whatever came next together. The Galactic might have been damaged, but with the artifact's power, they had a chance. A real chance to fight on. And Karos and Adira knew that no matter what lay ahead, they wouldn't face it alone. The Galactic slowly sailed through space, its damaged hull still holding strong thanks to the power of the artifact. The ship had survived, but just barely. Karos and Adira stood at the control panel, their eyes fixed on the stars ahead. The battle was over for now, but the challenges they faced were far from finished. The enemy would be back, and the only way to survive was to rebuild, to form alliances, and to adapt. As the ship drifted through the quiet void, Karos turned to Adira, his voice filled with determination. "We've made it this far. Together, we can make sure we make it the rest of the way." Adira nodded, her expression unreadable, but her eyes softening with a rare flicker of relief. "We've been through hell, Karos, but we've come out stronger because of it. I didn't think I could trust anyone outside of my crew, but you proved me wrong. You're more than just Earth's best pilot. You're a fighter, like us." Karos smiled slightly, the weight of her words settling deep within him. For someone who had spent so much of his life alone in the stars, working solo and trusting no one, her words meant more than she probably realized. In a way, they had both been through a trial by fire. And now, as unlikely as it seemed, they had become allies, partners in the truest sense. "I'm no hero, Adara. I just do what needs to be done. But if you're saying that I've earned your trust, then I'll take that as a win." Adira chuckled softly, and for a brief moment, the tension that had weighed on both of them lifted. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared understanding. Both of them had led lives where trust was a luxury, but here, among the ruins of their battle, they had built something stronger, an unspoken bond. The Galantor was still far from fixed, and the repair work would take time. Yet, with the artifact's power stabilizing the ship and Karos' steady hands on the controls, there was hope. They still had a mission to complete, but the road ahead felt more possible now. The enemy forces hadn't been entirely defeated. They would return, stronger and with vengeance in mind. But this time, the Galantor had something they didn't: the strength of an alliance that spanned galaxies. Karos looked over at the ship's damaged systems, already considering how to help them rebuild. "We're going to need supplies. We'll have to stop at the nearest station to refuel and get more resources." Adira nodded, her voice steady. "We can't risk getting too comfortable. The Marauders will be looking for us. We need to stay ahead of them, always one step ahead." Karos gave her a determined look. "I've never been afraid of running from a fight. But this time, we won't run. We'll fight back, and we'll fight together." With that, Karos set the course for the nearest station. The Galantor may have been broken, but its crew was still intact, and with the strength of their newfound alliance, they would face whatever came next. Together, they had already overcome the impossible, and whatever future challenges lay in wait, Karos and Adira were ready to face them side by side. A new chapter was about to begin, one where trust and determination would light the way forward.